You're listening to Life Check Yourself with life coach, transformational leader, and dating and relationship badass, Marni Battista. Every week, you'll get the raw truth from top experts and real people on the important life and love issues you want to know about. So, if you're ready to life check yourself in your relationships, your career, and the areas of your life that matter most to you, and you're not afraid to be called out on your, stuff, then you're ready for what's next.
Life Check Yourself with Dr.Diane Mueller. This advice for busy women to get the sexy back may surprise you. Ladies, welcome. Today, we're going to talk about the dynamic force behind the Libido Lounge with Dr. Diane Mueller. That is the name of her podcast that takes you on an enlightening journey through the multifaceted world of libido and sexual well-being. Woohoo! So if you've ever felt the highs and lows of sexual desire or faced the complexities of intimate relationships, Dr. Mueller is going to be our go-to expert. She's walked the walk. She's experienced firsthand the ebb and flow of libido due to life's challenges, including chronic illness. And she has gone above and beyond to reclaim her vitality and empower others to do the same. She has done a ton of training. She's worked with relationship and sex coaches. She's explored tantra. She's done pole dancing, sensual dancing. And she also has a doctorate in naturopathic medicine and acupuncture and oriental medicine, which is like a massive undertaking to get that credential. And so we're gonna talk about all things libido today. How did you get into that? I mean, you're here because when I was really young, I had a friend who was getting trained in acupuncture, and it was like a PhD program basically, and it's rigorous, super rigorous. So how do you go from that to let's talk about libido?
It's a really great question, and I think it'll lead us into the whole conversation today, because one of the things about holistic medical school is actually very similar to conventional medical school, which is, like you said, it's rigorous. It's like there was times, for example, where I could drink multiple triple shot espressos and fall asleep on my books, right? So there's a lot of in the library till 3 a.m. nights. And what winds up happening with that is the stress response goes up. The cortisol's high, the adrenaline's high, things are really out of balance. And one of the things that tends to happen, of course, with all the stress, it's like the overworked and underloved scenario, is that we wind up oftentimes in these scenarios having a lowering of our sex drive. And back then when I was in school, I was engaged, I was in this really great relationship, and I could not put anything into it. And it was like everything about this relationship was wonderful, but I was not able to show up for it because I was so exhausted. So that kind of got me interested, as well as a lot of other things. I have a history of sexual assault. I was raised super, super conservative. So a lot of talk about anything sexuality was really taboo. So it really launched this interest for me, as well as my meditation practice on pleasure, on embodiment, on feeling one's own body, and of using and finding ways to use pleasure and joy as a way of combating stress, right? Because it's like, how many ways can we actually do combat stress that are natural without things like wine, for example?
Right. Right. Or numbing out, like shutting down it rather than becoming enlivened. I think that's the old standby is just chilling, but low key really just shutting yourself down. I think this is so relatable because, and someone told me this, that men, when they're stressed out, like their libido maybe gets higher, or they think about sex as a way to relieve stress. And for women, we just aren't built that way. Like that's not going to be our number one thing. And so it can cause a lot of tension and struggle. So can you explain that a little bit? Like why this happens and why we're different and
what
the hell do you do about it?
It's very interesting, and it's a great point because there's really different neurocircuitry in the brain that literally we see in people with estrogen and progesterone dominance versus testosterone dominance, right? So as men and women, we have all of these hormones. But of course, some of us have more of these hormones than others. And so for those of us women that have estrogen and progesterone as more dominant than testosterone, right? We have different parts of our brain that say light up in different ways than if somebody is testosterone dominant. So there's a difference in how we process stress just because of what's happening in our brain regions. But another huge component of this that's been studied is how we bond. And so when we are intimate, when we are bonded to our partner, when we are cuddling, when we are orgasming, as women, we predominantly release oxytocin. And a lot of people have heard about oxytocin. It's been named as like the love hormone or the cuddle hormone. But what's interesting is while men release oxytocin, that's not their predominant hormone. Their predominant hormone when it comes to intimacy is a hormone called vasopressin. And that has a very, very, very different way of working on the body. And so men, when they are actually intimate and get this huge release of vasopressin, that can actually make them feel like this release and this intensity, and all of a sudden they're like focused and they're ready to work, versus oxytocin, when we release that, it's like, now I want to cuddle all night. Now I want to be held. And it actually has this very calming mechanism on our stress system. So some of it is due to what parts of the brain are actually lighting up, like I'm talking about. And the other component of the differences really have to do with what chemical is actually released in orgasm. And that's also important from a standpoint of how we bond, right? Like,
Right.
and how we also go into foreplay and into our relationships. Like for women, it's really important to have foreplay and cuddle and touch and all these things, because what happens with stress is stress will actually turn down oxytocin. It'll turn down that desire. But for men, the opposite happens. And so that's why, oftentimes men, when they're stressed, there can be this desire of like, I just need this release, right? Versus women, it's like, I just need something to take me down from my chaos and my overwhelm, because I can't even think about, sex because I'm so burnt out right now.
I love that. And I think that's so funny. I mean, I'm just giggling to myself because I think that shows up. I mean, I've been with my husband for like 14 years. And so that'll show up sometimes, right? He's like, let's go. And I'm like, let's chill, right? Like, get me there, baby, right? But like, it's so interesting. And rather than taking it personally or thinking it like that there's a flaw or that, they don't understand or whatever it is, to understand that it's just the way that intimacy is experienced, it sounds like, is like so different. So we have to figure out how do we kind of like meet literally in the middle so that we can decompress, so that we can raise our levels of oxytocin. So the question that is underneath all of this for me is like, busy woman listening, why should she care? Right? Like, why should she care about libido and being aware of the power of changing this in her own life? Why is it important?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's so important because there's two types of women I wind up working with in my libido work. And the one person realizes that libido's low and actually realizes that, wow, this is really impacting my relationships. Perhaps my long-term partner is just like expressing that there's this discrepancy, right? So there's that person that really feels like there's something that is missing because they don't have it. And then there's another type of woman that enters my work in a different way, which is kind of the way you're talking about, which is like, I don't even care. Like, I'm so busy. I'm just trying to get to the gym. I'm just trying to feed my kids.
Right, exactly.
My career. Like, I just put that on the back burner. And the way I really look at this, like the foundations of health, right? So we talk a lot in holistic care about some of the foundations of health being things like proper sleep, proper movement, good food, right? So these are the foundations of health, lots of water. And we're not yet, and I think this is because of a lot of history of literally centuries, especially for women, of sex and sexuality conversations being very taboo to talk about.
Right.
We're not talking about this as foundations. But what we actually see is when we are sexually intimate, we see scores on happiness going up. We see scores on anxiety going down. We see sleep improve. We see stress go down. We see enjoyment of life. We see reports of social isolation and feelings of loneliness actually go down. And there's some research that is connecting a proper and a healthy sex life with really maintaining the longevity of a happy relationship. A lot of people stay in relationships that are not happy, but there is a connection we see and a correlation we see in research with people that are engaging sexually on a regular basis. We can define what that means.
Yeah.
But engaging with sexuality on a regular basis and reporting a lot more relationship satisfaction. So the way I look at, and I talk to women that are kind of in this like, why is this important to me, is like, listen to these things. Like, do you feel like your relationship could use some more improvement? Do you feel lonely in your relationship? Do you feel like you could use more happiness? You could relax more. Would that be valuable? Would more sleep be valuable? Would a lower stress response be valuable? And if any of these things are true, then it probably is a good reason to work on one of these foundational health things.
Yeah. And I think that's so important because it's funny, like, I think about just even in the media, right? You see these couples, right? Or a movie or someone's just meeting and you're like, oh, it's so cute. They're making out, right? And then I think, well, that becomes a choice like after so many years, right? Yes. And I think that the old belief is like, oh, well, that just dies over time. And then sex is just like, maintenance or, something you're doing to make your partner happy or whatever it is. And what you're saying is that this is actually a part of your well-being. It's not less important than exercise or water. It's making sure. Also, I had a gynecologist on a month ago, who told me, like, also, by the way, if you don't use it, you lose it physically, which is like, I've shared that with people and they're like, no, when, how?
I mean, we can get it back, right? So it's kind of like exercise. You stop exercising for a while, then all of a sudden you start exercising and it's like, oh, it hurts and we can get it back. But one of the things we'll see, right, is like there is connection with pelvic tone, right? With like the healthy pelvic floor muscles and a active sex life. And so that is related, for example, to things like urinary incontinence or fecal incontinence as having these good pelvic muscles, right? So there's certainly a connection there. We can also have things happen over time where if we're not using that area like you're talking about, there's less blood flow, right? And if there's less blood flow, sometimes people will experience things like genital numbness where all of a sudden they don't feel anything anymore. And so I think from like the use it, lose it, right? You can get that back, but some of that is like, okay, well, how do we start working those muscles again? How do we start bringing blood flow to them again? And there might be a period where it's like we need to almost reset that blood flow and that neurological connection to that part of our body, to the tissue there, because once we restart that blood and restart that neurological connection, then all of a sudden you feel pleasure again. But the other way I look at this is like, we have so many pleasure zones around our body. Like some people have even reported having orgasms from their elbow, right? Because we have actually erotic tissue around our elbow. Some people do. And so we have all of these pleasure zones around our body. Like, why do we think we have them? It's because of all the chemicals that actually get released when we experience pleasure that help us do all the things that I previously mentioned, right? Our body is set up to self-regulate.
Oh my God.
And pleasure is one of the main ways we can actually support ourselves in that. And it's free. It's our own chemical-free cocktail.
Yay. Okay. So let's talk about some holistic ways for improving libido for women and how we improve this.
So there's a few different things. I mean, one is we have to figure out, of course, like what the root cause is, right? Okay. So, the common thing that a lot of people know about are testing hormones. So obviously look at hormones. One of the top hormones that I find that people are not always testing that is really implicated in libido is DHEA. So if you haven't checked your DHEA, definitely check it. Get it in a form called DHEAS. It's a blood test. You can get it in urine as well. But blood is a very common way, very accurate way of measuring that. The reference range is really, really wide for that. So most women feel best when they show up between 200 and 300, men between 300 and 400, right? So those are different reference ranges than you're going to find on the lab. The lab ranges are a lot bigger. And if you're in that low end, you can really have low libido from this. So you want to consider hormones.
Okay.
You want to consider blood flow, because blood flow oftentimes, like cardiovascular disease, sometimes low libido is the first sign of a cardiovascular problem, which like a lot of people know that for men, right? So we think about erectile dysfunction.
Right.
Alice and all these things. But that's also true for women. So something that can help for that is a nutrient called L-citrulline. You can also, of course, run tests to see if you have a problem. So those are a couple of things. Other things include working on your neurological system, so calming things. So you can use supportive herbs such as GABA and kava and threonine to calm your nervous system. But this is also where breath work comes in. This is also where embodiment practice comes in, because the act of enjoying pleasure is related to the act of being present in the moment. And this is where like meditation, mindfulness, orgasms come together, right? Yeah. So with that, so when I say that, one of the things, and a lot of the women I work with, one of the examples I give is like, who here has ever been in bed and they're having fun with their partner, and all of a sudden the brain starts going into the laundry list or the grocery list or the things like, and I think pretty much most women raise their hands. Yeah, this question.
I raise my hand.
Yeah, I raise my hand too. Like, crap, why am I like doing the laundry list or the grocery list right now? And so some of that, right, is because of how estrogen and progesterone impact the brain, and the part that it lights up is about having this huge awareness, this very diffuse awareness that provides a lot of value for us. But we have things kind of say lighting up in the brain in this way, which allows us to be like, oh, I hear the kid, I see the laundry, the things boiling on the stove, because we have this, the way our brain works. Well, that feeds into sexuality and time intimately, right? So if you're doing that list, that grocery list in the middle of sex, that's a sign that, okay, you're not in the body, you're not feeling present.
Yeah.
And so the practice of breath work, the practice of any sort of other mindfulness type of activity is one of the best things we can do to actually train ourselves to be present in that moment, to experience pleasure. And the more we're in that moment experiencing pleasure, the more oxytocin, the more stress resilience, the more happiness, the more serotonin, the happy hormone, and all those things. So I'll pause because I just said a lot.
No, but it's so true. It's like, first of all, everyone, I think it's really important to understand that, like you said, you've done this for so long and you've asked so many women. So if that's happening, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It doesn't mean your partner is a jerk. It doesn't mean he's not the guy for you necessarily, right? Like, so I think that's a really important piece I want to underscore. And then the other thing is, you're basically kind of talking about, and I say this a lot, how you do one thing is how you do everything, right? So if you can't be present, with your family at the holiday, or you can't, stop thinking about your laundry list while you're at dinner trying to connect with your kids, right? Or you're visiting friends and you're like, oh, I should go. Obviously, when you're sexually intimate, this is going to show up, right? So I think that it is a really important thing about presence, and that if you practice presence, you can like downshift, right?
Yeah.
And also, like, in the end, and I was just on a call with some entrepreneurs, and the truth is, like, the end of your life, you're not going to remember like the groceries or, the video that you had to make or the report you had to write. You're going to remember the times you've had with people that you love, right? So why would we not make that as important as all those
exactly.
things, right?
Exactly. And that's one of the things too we see in some of the research on bonding, right? Like intimacy increases how bonded we feel to our partner. So really in that standpoint from, okay, we're in these relationships, we choose these people to be with, oftentimes for life. And in these types of relationships, like, why do we not want to have the most level of joy and connection and that bonding and all those juicy, good feelings that don't have to die with long-term relationships? Like, this whole concept of like novelty and monogamy is one of my favorite concepts out there. Like, what do we do from a monogamous standpoint? What do we do to actually get back to some of those feelings, that dopamine, that desire, that drive that is there just like freely in the beginning of a relationship? And it's not that it's not accessible to us in long term. It's that most of us have not been taught how to do that in these longer term relationships. So we want to continue to come back to that. And that's a lot of the work I do in my work with women and with couples, is really teaching them how to do this, because essentially we want that joy, we want that bonding, we want that connection. Like that's the kind of stuff, like you're saying, we're on our deathbed and it's like, wow, I had these amazing relationships in my life, right? Those are the kind of things that most people are thinking about in those last moments, is who they care about.
Exactly. Okay, so then let's talk about the great question. I admit I've Googled this when my husband's like, I would like to have sex every day. And I'm like, what is average? I'm like, literally, what is average? So what is regular sex in a relationship? Drum roll, please.
It's such a big question. And it's a question I get asked almost daily.
Every day, right?
Right?
Basically, it comes down to who's right is what's really funny. But for me, right? Because I'm, that's the answer. We don't know.
No, because if you look scientifically, right? Like if we're doing this from purely a medical diagnostic, like we're going to put a medical label and call this a imbalance in the body, right?
Yeah.
In medical terms, basically low libido is defined as this medical jargon term called hypoactive desire disorder, right? So you have a low desire disorder, right? So it's low desire, right? In order to have this particular label, you have to have, quote unquote, a low sex drive for 6 months. But you can see even in how we define that medically, it's still like, well, what does low mean? Right? So we have not been able to define this from a true medical perspective, what is normal, what is not. So I find that a lot of people in really healthy relationships do well connecting sexually a minimum of 1 time a week. Right. And I find that that's a very great standard that a lot of people can commit to in very busy lives. I often recommend scheduling sex, those kind of things. And, that sounds kind of a little bit weird sometimes to people, but like most people schedule exercise, they schedule their kids' basketball practice, they schedule dinner time with the family at 6. When we schedule it, it happens. And it also kind of takes the pressure off when you're overwhelmed and busy and be like, okay, well, Friday night, that's our sex date night. So if it's Monday and it's tired and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this, I'm so tired, there's a level of permission around like, okay, we at least get this 1 time in, I need to sleep tonight, right? So it can take some of that pressure off.
I love it.
Right? And so then it's also beyond that, it's something that needs to be negotiated oftentimes and navigated between couples, right? And so another question with this is like, what is normal? What is a normal amount of intimacy? Well, also that comes back to our fundamental questions of like, what does libido serve? What does sex serve? It helps with stress. It helps with bonding. It helps with, happiness. It helps with sleep and all these things. So if you're finding that any of those things could be improved, it might be worth trying to improve to increase your sex life. And maybe if you're having it once a week, what happens to those things? What happens to your happiness, your connection, your sleep if you increase it to 2 or 3 times a week, right? So I think we have to use it because it's not defined. And we get to write our own rules, but these are the things that you're looking out for. And these are the things I would recommend you look out for as far as like, okay, is this improving your relationship? Is this improving your sleep? And if it is, then usually it's worth prioritizing bringing it to your life, right?
I just need to get my ass off the couch. I swear to God, that is my problem, right? I'm like, oh, we're just chilling, we're watching TV. Like my cuddle factor, right? That part gets met because like we're connecting, even though we're like, we're doing that together. And I did this scheduling thing, and I actually wrote an article about it, and it really did. It was great. It was great. So I think that when you're looking at how this impacts other parts of our life, I always like to break things down into possible experiments, right? Like, what if you tried it for 30 days and you noticed, am I more restful? Am I happier? Am I more alivened? All of those things. So there's really like no downside. There's no downside to sex.
There's no downside. And yeah, I like the challenges too. I've occasionally given women, depending upon the scenario, 30-day orgasm challenge.
And what's that?
Orgasm, self-pleasure, because I don't like to focus on orgasm, but self-pleasure. Yeah. And the idea with this is like, it can be self-pleasure, it can be partner play, but the idea is getting connected to your own body and learning your body more. And if you have an orgasm, great. But the idea is to continue to connect to oneself, to connect to your pleasure zones, your erogenous zones, and just use it as, like you said, it's an experiment, right? It's an experiment to just notice, like, what happens if you do this on a daily basis, even if it's 5 minutes, right? And what happens? And it's like anything else we experiment with. We experiment taking dairy out of our diet for 30 days. What do we notice, right? So we use this, and this is where it's like, it's a very cool way of like, you get to write your own rules on this. You get to define your own life, but using it as a trial to say, wow, this is how my life really changes with regular engagement, or maybe not. But at least then and you can design your life around the uniqueness of what your body and your relationship need.
I love this. You said engagement. I'm like, focus more on your engagement with your partner than your engagement on your Instagram account. Okay, and last thing, in your bio, you talked about your own childhood and you shared here like, these conversations were taboo. Like some ladies who are listening don't have a partner. They don't have time for self-pleasure. Like this is just like, not a knot or a fear or something that feels uncomfortable. How do you start, before we go, how do you start to unpack and unwind that if this whole conversation is uncomfortable for you?
I would start with just doing embodiment practices, right? So just like, because the other thing we want to remember is like pleasure and oxytocin aren't just related to sex. Like we get a high amount during sex, but it's not the only way we release these things. So really be starting with becoming more aware of one's own body and likes and dislikes. And this can be as simple as like you're sitting in a chair, like people that are listening, if you're not driving, and you can do this right now, like you're sitting in a chair and you just close your eyes and just put your hands directly like tickling your neck or tickling your arm. And what you're doing here is you're just bringing yourself into your body to get aware of your own sensations, right? And that's because once we begin to say, open up our own sensations and our own pleasure one step at a time, that's oftentimes where we can start moving more and more and more into our own erogenous zones. It is like if you are new to exploring your own genitalia and you haven't looked at your vulva, you haven't used vibrators, you haven't done any of that, and the idea of self-pleasure is new to you, I would definitely recommend starting with just these very, very light touches, starting with dance or movement or something like that. If you can, you don't have time for that. Everybody has time to touch their leg, right? Right. I need to work that in. So the idea of this is just some self things there. And then you can get tiny self-pleasure toys called bullets that are used externally and just experiment. It's like 1 minute at night, get one of these, just sticking externally on your external clitoris, just to experience that sensation for a little while on the lowest setting. And the idea is we're just waking up your body one body part at a time to allow it to feel and allow it to come into the moment and allow it to experience sensation and see how that feels. And follow your feeling, follow your intuition, and come join me on the Libido Lounge if you want to ask questions or hear more on this. We talk about a lot of these kind of things.
I love that suggestion. And I think it's important because the bottom line is like, I just talked about like, how can you be more expressed for who you are fully? And your body is not just this like, bitch you whine at all day long about not being good enough. And I think that's what most people do, right? Like, not like, why does my knee hurt? Why does this hurt? Like, why are you look like this? Why do you have this? How can I fix that? And it's like, no, being fully expressed is like seeing it as much more than something that isn't good enough and can actually bring us joy and pleasure. And so if that's something that's important, like how can I be more of who I am, then take a baby step, tiptoe in. And I love all these suggestions. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Marni. It's been fabulous talking to you.
I love it. I think my husband can hear me. I'm committing to more sex.
Yay!
More sex in the cabin.
My work here is done.
Yes, your work here is done. Ladies, absolutely go check out this libido lounge that Dr. Diane Mueller has put together. She's got a gift about how to revive your love life, 5 steps to mind-blowing orgasms in romance, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. And we are just super excited that you have been here we've been talking a lot about our girly parts in the last few weeks, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I love it. Ladies, you can always find more of me on Instagram at Marni Battista _. You can message me and say hi on my good old fashioned Facebook account, Marni Battista. But whatever you do, go get a bullet, go find your man, and life check yourself. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now. Hey, thanks for tuning into today's show. So if being in an intimate relationship in which you feel 100% seen, heard, and accepted by a high caliber man is a priority for you right now, and you're interested in seeing if you're a fit for working with me and my team at Dating with Dignity, here's what I want you to do. Just head over to DWD VIP, that's D as in dating, W, D as in dating, VIP.com, and book a call to speak with my team. We'll get on the phone with you for about 60 minutes and you'll get crystal clear on what's stopping you from finding true love right now. We'll also take a look at what you want to create, what you want your whole life to look like when you're able to finally be fully expressed as a woman in a healthy relationship with an incredible guy. And if we can help you get from where you are right now to where you want to be, we will show you the fastest path possible that makes sense for you to do that. We help smart, successful women all over the world solve this one missing piece in their life so they can finally have it all. So to see if we can help you do the same thing, head over to DWDVIP.com. I'm Marni Battista, and let's talk soon.